Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about something that came up on ex-Mormon Reddit relatively recently, which is why some people who leave the LDS or Mormon church then choose to come back to it. And for the purposes of this discussion, by leaving the church, what I mean is not necessarily having your records removed from the church, but just no longer considering yourself Mormon. And the reason I wanted to talk about this was because there were a lot of insightful comments that I saw both on the ex-Mormon subreddit and on the Mormon subreddit, which had a related post. But I wanted to talk about it in sort of a combined format because I didn't see a complete explanation of the various reasons why people come back. And so I want to talk about several reasons why people might come back after leaving. The first is that they actually did leave because they quote unquote wanted to sin. And in this mindset, they usually, when they were teenagers or young adults, wanted to do things that went against what the church teaches in their personal lives. And so they chose to step away from the church primarily for those reasons. And that isn't to say that they didn't stop believing that the church was true, but their decision that the church wasn't true was heavily influenced by their desire to do particular things that the church didn't approve of. And the reason why I think that those people are the most likely to come back out of all the people who leave the church, well, there are a couple of reasons. The first is that it just makes sense that those people would be more likely to come back, because that means when they have problems in their life that are the result of doing things that don't line up with what the church teaches, they will see that as a confirmation that the church was actually a good thing in their life and may have the desire to return to the church. Because it is true that there are some things that the church teaches that do prevent some problems for some people. If you never drink alcohol at all, you're not going to become an alcoholic. If you never use illegal drugs, you're not going to be addicted to those drugs or get in trouble for using those drugs. And if you don't have sex outside of marriage, you're probably not going to have as much of a chance to have certain diseases or get pregnant or get someone else pregnant outside of a marriage situation, outside of a committed relationship. And so there are some things connected to faithful membership in the LDS church that do protect people from certain problems. And when people experience those problems, if they grew up in the church, they can think, oh, well, if I go back to the church, then maybe that will remediate some of these problems that I'm having in my life right now. And that actually may be true, because there are things associated with church membership that can be good for some people. And another reason I suspect that this is the most likely group of people to go back to the church after leaving is because if they come back and then share their stories, I think that's part of what gives a lot of members of the church the impression that that's the reason why the majority of people leave the church. Because they think that, oh, I hear so many stories about people leaving because they wanted to sin and then they come back, therefore that must be the reason. When in reality, it's not that the majority of people who leave the church wanted to sin, it's that a higher percentage of the people who leave the church and come back wanted to quote unquote sin. And so I think that that explains some of what's going on in terms of how current members of the church, faithful members of the church, perceive former members of the church. And then another reason number 3, why I think that this group is probably the most likely to go back, is because personal experiences can change easily over time. And also, I think that in some ways it is easier to follow the standards of the LDS church as an older person than it is as a younger person. When you're younger, a teenager or a younger adult, you have hormones urging you to, in some cases, take risks, in some cases, have a lot of sex. And I think that that can cause a lot of people to struggle when they're younger with the standards of the LDS Church. And then when they're older and things have calmed down, they realize that for them now, it's not as big of a deal to follow these standards. And so they find themselves drawn to the church again. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And I don't think it's because they're quote unquote better people now. I think it's just because at that stage in life, they're more adapted to want to follow certain teachings of the LDS Church than they were before. And so that's one reason why people who leave the LDS Church sometimes choose to come back, but it's not the only reason. And I think people do other people a disservice when they assume that that's the only reason, because there are other groups of people who come back. There are people who know certain things about church history that are disturbing that still choose to come back after leaving. And so what's the most common group of people who come back after learning disturbing things about the LDS Church and its history? Well, I think that group is a group that has learned some disturbing things, maybe not all the disturbing things that they could have learned, but a significant amount of disturbing things to the point they left in the first place. But then they have a spiritual experience or some other type of experience that they take as a sign that God wants them to go back to the LDS Church, and that outweighs whatever they have learned for them. And I think that you can outweigh really any information with a spiritual experience if that's what your epistemology is still based on. But I do think it's harder the more negative information you have about the LDS Church to reach that point where it gets outweighed. Because one thing to remember is that there's sort of a spectrum of how much negative information you know about the LDS Church. And so if you only know some information and not all the information, maybe you'll find apologetic responses to some of the information that you know, and that'll satisfy you, and you'll be more likely to come back. I think the more information you know, and the more information you have actual sources for and know what those sources are, the harder it would be to undo that in your mind, the harder it would be to reconcile that in your mind and come back to the church. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, because again, if your epistemology is still based on your spiritual experiences, or at least if you haven't deconstructed your previous spiritual experiences and deconstructed other spiritual experiences that you hear about, then you really might find yourself at a point where you feel like the most likely explanation for those experiences is that the church is true, and that outweighs everything else you know about it that's negative. And so I think that that's the group of people that's most likely to come back that left because of information, is the group of people that didn't fully deconstruct their previous spiritual experiences, and so, or didn't even have spiritual experiences before but suddenly do after the fact, and then think, oh, this means I have to go back. This is what the church is telling me that these spiritual experiences mean, and I think it's true. And so that's the second group. But I do think that there is, or at least there could be, a third group, which is people who deconstructed their spiritual experiences. People who are in the same boat I am basically right now and still choose to go back later. But in order for that to happen, I think one of a couple of things would have to happen. Either you would have to relearn how to trust spiritual experiences due to having stronger experiences than you've had in the past, or due to having an overwhelming influx of anecdotal stories all pointing to the fact that the church was true to the point that you felt you couldn't ignore them. or you would have to have some type of brain damage that caused you to forget certain logical patterns that you'd learned that were leading you to believe that the church wasn't true. And so I'm not saying, I think that there's a tendency as members, former members of the LDS church to think, oh, well, that could never happen to me. I could never get to the point where I would go back. And I think that that's a little prideful, because I feel like it's sort of the same thing in some ways as a current member of the church thinking, oh, well, I could never get to the point where I would leave. The truth is, we don't know. There might be things that would get us to that point where we would go back. And so I think it's a little bit foolish to say, oh, well, that could never happen to me. And if you've had the experiences I've had, if you know the things I know, then you would never go back. Because I do think that, especially if someone hasn't deconstructed their spiritual experiences or just how spiritual experiences work, if they don't have a good explanation outside of the spiritual experiences, taking them at face value, then I think it's actually a lot more likely than we realize for people to go back. And even if they have deconstructed their spiritual experiences, that doesn't mean that it's 100% impossible for them to go back. So I think we need to look at things from that perspective and realize that the things that we take as reliable information about whether the church is true or not vary from person to person. And what makes a person leave or stay in or come back to the LDS church is complicated. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I know I haven't posted in a while, but I'll try to film a few videos today and put them up over the next little bit. And if you like this video, please consider subscribing, and please like it, and I will see you all next time. Bye.